if you write a gospel, Tim, you're not going to put your name on it.
Of course not.
You're gonna put someone who is important. You're gonna put Peter's name on it, or you're gonna put Thomas's name. You're gonna put Philip's name on it. Better yet, you're gonna put Mary Magdalene's name on it, because that's gonna cause a stir.
Yeah.
So nowadays, a lot of the like forgery, plagiarism is me taking your stuff and putting my name on it. But what we're talking about here is these groups taking their stuff and putting someone else's name on it.
This is a common apologetic talking point, but it doesn't hold up. Wes Huff and Tim Barnett simply assume that if a gospel writer wanted to use someone else's name, they would automatically choose the most famous apostle. But that is only speculation. No apologist I know of explains why this must be true, and there are good reasons to think otherwise. First, Peter was not known as a learned man. Acts chapter 4 verse 13 even calls him unschooled and ordinary. Most scholars think he was illiterate. If someone wrote a book in polished Greek and claimed it was Peter's, it would raise suspicion. In fact, we have an example of this. The Gospel of Peter was rejected as a forgery. If the gospel writers were clever, they would avoid repeating that mistake. Second, this argument assumes that only books attached to the biggest apostles would gain traction. That is clearly not true. If you have not heard of Pseudo-Dionysius, look it up. Dionysius appears only once in the New Testament in Acts 17:34 as a convert of Paul in Athens. Centuries later, an anonymous writer produced a set of works under his name. You might think an obscure figure would not carry weight, but his writings such as the Divine Names, the Mystical Theology, the Celestial Hierarchy, the Ecclesiastical Hierarchy, and several letters became massively influential. For about 1,000 years, hardly anyone in the church doubted the attribution, until scholars in the 15th and 16th centuries recognized the works were written much later. That is a striking example of a forgery using a little-known name that still achieved wide acceptance. Wes also should not forget the obvious. Billions of Christians today revere the Gospels attributed to Mark and Luke, even though neither of them was an apostle. Their names continue to carry authority for most believers. So if the goal was to produce an influential gospel, there was never a rule that the writer had to pretend to be the most famous apostle. The idea that only the biggest names could succeed does not fit the historical record. Third, the New Testament already contains gospels linked to major apostles, Matthew and John. By Wes's own reasoning, those attributions should make us more cautious, not less. Are we sure Matthew and John actually wrote those books? The tradition is late and uncertain, and Wes's argument doesn't touch that question. It seems he just assumes the attribution is accurate without much skepticism. Fourth, Mark and Luke were hardly nobodies. Mark is mentioned in Acts, Colossians, 2 Timothy, Philemon, and 1 Peter, more than many of the 12 disciples, most of whom disappear after the early chapters of Acts. Early tradition connects Mark with Peter, which could easily give the name enough weight to lend credibility to a gospel. Luke is also mentioned in Colossians, Philemon, and 2 Timothy, and church fathers like Irenaeus, Eusebius, and Jerome all highlight his relationship with Paul. Even if Mark and Luke were not apostles, they may have been respected figures whose names carried authority. Finally, and most importantly, none of the Gospels identify their authors as Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. The titles were attached later by church leaders. It is unrealistic to think all four authors independently chose to write the Gospel according to ... in exactly the same format. Mark even gives his own title in chapter 1 verse 1, the beginning of the Gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. The fact is that the names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were added by scribes to the manuscripts to help communities keep track of which gospel was which. For that reason, speculation about which famous name an author might have chosen is not really helpful, at least for the synoptic gospels. The accounts are internally anonymous. The real question is whether the early church correctly identified their authors. Did they have solid historical evidence? Based on what we know today, that is unlikely. The first clear public attribution of the four Gospels as a set comes around 180 CE with Irenaeus, roughly a century after the usual dates for Mark, Matthew, and Luke. 4th century historian Eusebius quotes the early 2nd century figure Papias as saying that Mark wrote down what he remembered from Peter, not in order. Yet the Mark we have reads as a continuous, ordered narrative. Papias also says Matthew compiled the sayings of Jesus in Hebrew or Aramaic, while the Gospel of Matthew we have was composed in Greek and is not a simple collection of Jesus' sayings. So if the early church attached Matthew and Mark to the first two Gospels mainly on the basis of Papias, that rests on shaky historical ground and cannot justify confidence in the attribution. Perhaps they once had earlier, better evidence, but we cannot assume such sources existed when none have survived. This is different from a lot of Greco-Roman writing. Many authors tell you who they are, such as Thucydides, Polybius, Josephus, Tacitus, or Suetonius. We also get near contemporary confirmations. For example, Pliny the Younger wrote to Tacitus, who was his friend, referencing what Tacitus was writing. It's true that some ancient authors do not identify themselves in their work and write in third-person perspective, such as Caesar's commentaries on the Gallic War. But in these instances, scholars can still be confident to say that Caesar was the author because there were other contemporary external sources to confirm the authorship. Cicero was Caesar's exact contemporary and referred to his writings while Caesar was alive. Aulus Hirtius, who was one of Caesar's officers, added the 8th book to Gallic War and explicitly called the work Commentaries of Our Caesar's Wars in Gaul. Later writers like Suetonius repeated an attribution that was already established by people on the scene. In cases like this, authorship rests on early, multiple lines of testimony. With the Gospels, the names show up clearly much later, carried by church tradition, not by the writers signing their work, or by contemporary external witnesses. We don't have a Cicero or Hirtius for the Gospels. If you know other pieces of evidence that can be used to support the traditional authorship of the four Gospels, let me know in a comment. Hello my friends, this is Shem from Mindful Living. Welcome. As you can tell, this channel takes Christian claims and puts them under the light of reason and evidence. Many of us have a soft spot for religious ideas, which can make us accept easy, comfortable answers. Here, I want to encourage you to think for yourself, ask hard questions, and follow the evidence. If that's your thing, please subscribe if you have not already. Alright, let's keep going.
Now, what I think is interesting is if you were going to make that up, why on earth not put an apostle's name on it? And I think that connects it with its validity in the sense of there is no reason to put Mark's name on Mark and Luke's name on Luke unless that's who wrote it.
This is a weak argument. Wes sets up a false dilemma. Either the early church correctly identified the authors, or someone deliberately made it up. But there is an obvious third option. They could simply have been mistaken. Being wrong does not require deceit. Early church fathers could easily have believed Mark wrote Mark and Luke wrote Luke, and still have been wrong. And if Wes's best support for traditional authorship is they had no reason to fake it, that's paper thin. How could Wes or anyone else know that to be true? It won't convince anyone who isn't already committed to believing the traditional names.
Sometimes you'll read this stuff and scholars will talk about the Gospels being internally anonymous. And you'll think, what are they talking about? Well, the idea is that if you took off those headings, the Gospel according to, and just read the Gospel, you wouldn't know who the author was. And so that's the idea that they're internally anonymous.
I'm glad Wes at least acknowledges this. Internally anonymous is exactly right. The authors never identify themselves inside the text. That's a crucial fact. So where does Wes want to go with this admission?
Some of these other gospels, these apocryphal gospels, go to lengths to try to validate who the author is. And I think that actually the internal anonymity speaks to its credibility. That rhymed. I like that. That's good. The internal anonymity speaks to its reliability in the sense that it's not concerned with, hey, I'm this guy, believe me.
So let me get this straight. If the gospel writers had signed their names, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that would make them less credible? But since they left them anonymous, that makes them more credible? Really? I'm sorry, but this is absolutely ridiculous. In every other area of scholarship, history, or even everyday life, we judge a claim more credible if the author is willing to stand behind it. Imagine reading a newspaper article on an important event. If it's anonymous, we immediately ask why the author is hiding. Is it rumor? Is it propaganda? Transparency about authorship almost always increases accountability, not the reverse. Yes, some apocryphal works are presented to be written by apostles and even go out of their way to validate that. That undermines them. But that doesn't mean anonymity automatically enhances reliability. Anonymity just makes authorship unknown, which means we have less information to assess bias, context, and accuracy. We can't investigate their credentials. That's not more credible. That's simply less testable. And notice the inconsistency. Many New Testament books are not anonymous. Paul names himself. James names himself. Jude names himself. By Wes's logic, would he treat those letters as less credible just because the authors identify themselves? Of course not. Wes would likely say the opposite. Naming the author helps establish credibility. If internal anonymity automatically boosts credibility, then what about apocryphal texts that are also internally anonymous, like the Gospel of Mary? Does their anonymity count as a mark of reliability? I doubt Wes would accept that either. Do you see the pattern? When a book is inside the biblical canon, anonymity is treated as a virtue. When a book is outside the canon, anonymity becomes a vice or at least irrelevant. That's not a consistent standard. The motivational reasoning behind Wes's claim is obvious. That's not how real scholarship works. Scholarship follows where the evidence leads, even when the results cut against our preferences. And since Wes presents himself as a New Testament scholar, calling himself a manuscript guy, the bar should be higher, not lower. Leaning on selective reasoning to validate a predetermined conclusion is exactly what careful academic work is supposed to avoid.
Because I'm a manuscript guy. The manuscripts that we have where it's like the first page and it has that title, the Gospel according to in Greek, on copies of Matthew, it's always the Gospel of Matthew. It's never misnamed. It's always the Gospel of Luke. It's never misnamed. It's always the Gospel of John. And that, I think, also speaks to the fact that from as early as you want to push it, there was total consensus that these were the authors, and you never see someone else's name being attributed to what we have a canonical gospel.
It's true that once titles appear in our manuscripts, the canonical gospels are labeled consistently, but that only shows that after a title was attached, scribes copied that title faithfully. It does not tell us when or how the titles first got attached. If church tradition settled on those names in the late 2nd century and that choice became authoritative, then of course later copies would all carry the same title. Consistency in a transmission isn't proof of original authorship. You can see the same thing outside the canon, where the title is preserved. Gospel of Thomas manuscripts consistently call it the Gospel according to Thomas. Does that prove Thomas wrote it? No. A consistent title tells you about copying, not necessarily origin. This also doesn't change the internal anonymity of the Gospels. Inside the texts themselves, the authors never name themselves, and the earliest manuscripts we have with titles show up roughly a century after the Gospels were written. saying the title appears 100 years later, therefore it must be original, is a big leap. Early citations point the same direction. When Justin Martyr quotes the Gospels in mid-2nd century, he calls them the memoirs of the apostles. He does not say Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. If those titles were already standard, it's odd that he never uses them, not even once, in the works we have. The first time we clearly see all four names attached as a set is around 180 CE with Irenaeus, about a century after composition. At that distance, we can't just assume the names rest on solid, contemporary evidence rather than developing tradition or speculation. Christian apologists often say the four Gospels were never known by other titles, but that isn't quite true. They usually skip over Marcion, an early 2nd century Christian who produced the first known list of inspired texts. Marcion accepted a single gospel, which is essentially Luke, but he didn't call it the Gospel of Luke. He called it the Gospel of the Lord, and said its authority came from Paul, not from Luke. If the Gospel according to Luke had already been the standard title across the churches, why wouldn't Marcion use it? The most natural reading is that the idea of Luke as author had not yet emerged as the standard in his region. So yes, later manuscripts are consistent about the titles, but that shows how tradition was copied, not how authorship was established. The real historical questions, who first attached those names, on what evidence, and how early, remain unanswered. Some Christians will say I'm being hyperskeptical, claiming if the early church fathers agreed on the traditional attributions, why dispute them? And why even mention Marcion? He was a heretic. The mainstream consensus should carry the most weight. I used to think that way too, but that mindset tells us more about our desire to outsource judgment than it does about the strength of the evidence. Church consensus can be wrong for a very long time. Earlier in this video, I mentioned Pseudo-Dionysius. It's appropriate to bring him up again here. For centuries, Christians cherished his writings as if they came from the convert of Paul mentioned in Acts 17. These works shaped medieval theology across East and West. What finally broke the spell was much later. Renaissance humanists and scholars in the 15th and 16th centuries, such as Erasmus, noticed the language, philosophy, and historical references fit the late 5th or early 6th century, not the apostolic era, showing the author was a pseudonymous writer now known as Pseudo-Dionysius. In other words, a near-universal Christian consensus reinforced by liturgy and theology for 1,000 years still landed on the wrong author. That doesn't mean everything the tradition affirmed is false. It means consensus is not a substitute for evidence. If the church could fail to detect a set of writings as forgery for centuries, we should be cautious before treating later attributions of the Gospels as beyond question, especially when the texts are internally anonymous and the first mention of the authorship appears almost 100 years after composition. Trust is not a method, verification is. If you are a Christian and you are still with me, you might feel a strong urge to push back. That's understandable. But ask yourself, are the names of the gospel writers so central that if the early church got one wrong, the whole faith collapses? If Mark wasn't the author, but say Barnabas or another second-generation Christian, does that make the content worthless? It doesn't have to. Remember, the Gospels don't name their authors. Those attributions come from later church tradition. We don't need to be dogmatic about them. Sure, if Matthew or John were truly written by Jesus' disciples, that could add credibility. But do you really think a text not written by an eyewitness, like the ones attributed to Mark or Luke, must therefore have no value? I don't. What matters is being honest about what we can and cannot know, and then sizing our confidence to the evidence. Think in terms of a spectrum. Sometimes we can be very confident, sometimes moderately confident, sometimes uncertain. It isn't all or nothing. I'm not claiming Mark definitely didn't write Mark. I'm saying we don't have enough evidence to insist that he must have. Uncertainty can feel uncomfortable, but learning to sit with it isn't indecisiveness, it's intellectual maturity. What do you think? I'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments and let's talk. And if you want to dig deeper into whether each gospel is an independent eyewitness account, check out the video on screen. I discuss how the gospel writers copied and edited one another. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.